Hello, everyone. I'm Margarita Pinton Perez, the Community Partnership Leader with the Learning Network at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network, welcome to our Resource Spotlight, Supporting Safety, Lessons Learned from a Culturally Informed Peer Support Program for Newcomer Arabic-Speaking Communities. We would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and hosting this virtual event on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenampewak, and Chet'ongton nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We give our deep respect to the first inhabitants of this land and recognize that an acknowledgement of Indigenous land and sovereignty comes with the responsibility to understand the history and ongoing impacts of settler colonialism. These impacts continue to be felt in disproportionate and everyday ways against Indigenous communities. We also reflect on those who came to this land involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. As the Learning Network is focused on mobilizing knowledge to end the spectrum of gender-based violence, we also recognize that today these nations face disproportionate forms of gender-based violence and a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA+ peoples. We recognize the responsibility for our work to be informed of the colonial imprint and harms that shapes the experiences of GBV among Indigenous communities. We commit to furthering our work in ways that best uphold solidarity with Indigenous survivors and those supporting them. We are thrilled to be joined today by Yasmin Hussein and Tagrid Al-Sumari to share their important work in better supporting newcomer communities. Yasmin Hussein works in community development with the London Intercommunity Health Centre, where she works with and in communities to tackle realities of systemic marginalization and address barriers to health and well-being. Previously, Yasmin was the manager for public education and community programs at the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration, where she developed and facilitated multiple community education strategies, initiatives, and programs addressing gender-based violence. Tagrid Al-Sumari holds a PhD in media and communication and brings over 15 years of experience in research, community outreach, and program development, focusing on gender-based violence and media memory studies. In her current role as coordinator for public education and community programs at the MRCSSI, she has played a key role in developing and facilitating a curriculum to raise awareness about intimate partner violence and support her safety. You may read more about their bios in the link provided in the chat. Yasmin and Tagrid, welcome. I will now pass it over to you to begin your presentation and rejoin you once again for the Q&A period after your presentation.
Thank you, Margarita, for that lovely welcome and introduction. And thank you to the Learning Network for having Tagrid and I here today. We're excited to be here and to talk about the Supporting Her Safety program. It's been 3.5 years of a lot of passionate work for Tagrid and myself, and it's been an honor to develop and facilitate this program. And so we're excited to be able to share it with you today. It took us quite a bit of time to think about how to structure this presentation and what to focus on because there's so much. But I think, two key questions shaped sort of our thinking about what was important to maybe bring to life for people here today. And so we want to focus on, what made the program culturally integrative and what made the Supporting Her Safety program a safe space where women really felt committed and motivated to participate and share their experiences really openly and genuinely. I think because that's what made it such a powerful experience for us as facilitators, but certainly for everyone in the program. And so the learning objectives that we identify today align with those two questions. So we hope that people leave today with a better understanding of, the program supporting her safety, the curriculum, the program and its impact, but also what made it culturally integrative. And also, we hope that you leave away with some ideas, some strategies or thoughts of how maybe that you may integrate into your work, thinking about if you're addressing IPV or GBV in newcomer or Muslim communities, what can that look like? And so hopefully we meet those learning objectives today. Our presentation will provide a bit of a background to the Supporting Her Safety program, and then we'll focus on our approach and key principles. Then we'll focus on what strategies we use to really create a safe space for participation and learning. We'll share some practical tools that we developed as part of the program, but how we also integrated that as a way of strengthening skills for participants so that they're leaving away with new skills and had the opportunity to practice. We'll also share some of the program impacts and our own personal reflections and some resources that we've been working on that are born out of the Supporting Her Safety program and that we hope to have available to share with everyone soon. And then, of course, we'll move to the Q&A. So Supporting Her Safety is rooted in sort of community or public education principles. And so it's a program that really was designed to think about how we build awareness and equip people with both new knowledge, but also with skills and strategies of how you support someone who is experiencing abuse. So we took a peer support lens to this public education program and really focused on sort of 4 key areas in the program that we evaluated, but that we wanted participants to walk away with. So hopefully that they would walk away with being able to recognize different forms of abuse and warning signs, so expand their understanding of what abuse looks like and sounds like, and how we recognize certain tactics, and also think about responses. What are some of the common responses that are held in communities that might be harmful norms that we can challenge or think about, reframe, and what does compassionate care and support look like? And then we focused on what it means to support someone who's experiencing abuse or someone who discloses. And we'll share with you the 5 Alifs tool that we created, which is a trauma and culturally informed tool of how to provide peer support. And we also discussed what it means to practice self-care or take care of yourself as someone who's supporting someone who's experiencing abuse. This program, a lot of our work was funded. We started this work actually really around the time of COVID. Our first pilot was in January 2021. And so we were lucky, along with many other organizations, to receive sort of from the Canadian Women's Foundation through WAGE some of the initial emergency funding around during COVID, also from the London Community Foundation, and sustain some of that funding through the Canadian Women's Foundation to really focus on addressing IPV with newcomer Arabic-speaking women. And so to really develop this program, we started with a pilot of 8 women in January 2021. Some of the women were women that we knew or had relationships with. I was doing a lot of work with youth at the time. And so was thinking about how do we start these conversations in community and what might it look like? And so reached out to women where there was a relationship and invited them in to thinking about, would you participate in this program? We want to sort of explore how we talk about IPV. And so they committed. And so that pilot really led to the opportunity to do many more groups moving forward and the funding that sustained that. So we're really grateful to the funding we had.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmin, and welcome everyone. I agree with Yasmin that we were fortunate with our pilot group because it leads for 21 groups over the period starting from January 21 to May 24. And right now at MRC, we're starting a new round of groups. But over the past few years, we've been, the total of sessions facilitated was more than 234 sessions with women. And we had 200 women who joined or completed the program. Actually, we had more than this because some people attended and maybe paused after 3 sessions for many reasons, having babies, school, change in schedule, getting new jobs. So 21 women didn't complete the program. And I think maybe a few of them left the program because the content was triggering for them or they had experienced abuse in the past. So most of our participants were from the Middle East, Arabic-speaking Muslim women, mainly from Syria. like around 70% of the women were from Syria. We had people from Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Sudan, Iraq, Egypt, and Eritrea as well. So the age was really starting from 20 and up to 60 plus. We had young women from 20 to 29 years old, and the majority were between 30 and 40 years, like, because most of them women who attended the program were married. So basically we will see this age is the most age we covered in our groups. And we had older women as well. So I think this the length of time in Canada was really important in developing and structuring the curriculum, because we take in consideration like for how long have been women here in Canada. So we had fresh newcomers and newcomers. When we say fresh newcomers, people who have been here for 1 year or less than 1 year. And it's really different from people who have been for 2 or 5 years and up. So I think the majority were here between 2 and 5 years, like around 50%, and 6 to 9 years. And we had also part of them 10 and plus years. So people who have been here for a long time. So we started the program virtually over Zoom. As COVID hits, everything was online, and we delivered it both in Arabic and English. Me and Yasmin both facilitated the program. It has been for 10 sessions, and sometimes we add one session to review and touch on different things upon the need of the groups itself. In each group, we would have basically between 8 to 16 women. This is the range. Most of, like, we had sometimes really large groups, and sometimes like 10 women in each group. Other than the pilot, we had one time we've been running 5 groups at the same time. And over the time, we learned like what really works best for women related to time. So we had seasons. Usually we had some like one round in the fall, one round in the winter, and one round in the spring. And when I say fall, like, we usually take in consideration the date where school starts. So after 2 weeks, we take 2 weeks for women just to settle down, get their routines like on, and then we started the groups. Also, for the time over the 3 years, maybe more than 3 years, we learned that the best time that worked for women: morning, afternoon, and evening. And we offered the 3 times for each group. So just to give you an idea about the curriculum, the first session was a welcome and an introduction to what they want to learn or what they will be learning during the sessions of the program. But I feel like the basic session was the starting point with them, which is the continuum of relationships and abuse versus conflict. And my colleague Yasmin will touch on this. Why was it really important session after a few minutes. Also, we spent 2 sessions on introducing 6 forms of abuse and also practicing those 6 forms of abuse. So we used to say for them that those are the ABCs of IPV, or gender-based violence. If you didn't get those, we can't move in the program. And we give them as much as they want or they need to practice those forms, and then go from there. Because after those sessions, we touch on impacts of abuse, red flags, recognizing harmful responses, also like checking in with someone we are worried on how to take the first step. Also at the end, like maybe the 3 last sessions, we focus on supporting how to respond to disclosure. And here we were where we introduced the 5 Alifs. And also we practice on 5 Alifs, and at the end we do a review and a discussion. You can see a few examples of things like materials we used. We used videos, we used scenarios, we used a graphic story, both in Arabic and English.
Thank you, Tawhid. I'll talk a little bit about how we built the program and sort of the key elements of our approach and some of our guiding principles. So I think the first one was thinking about what it means to take a culturally integrative approach. And so I really think it means moving beyond sort of adapting universal programs and then layering in some cultural adaptations or cultural content. I think it's really thinking about the context of the women we're working with and what defines that context. I have a graphic at the end of today's presentation, but it's thinking about women were physically in Canada, often as Tahrid identified, arrived fairly recently. And so they're embedded within a new community here in Canada with their family. They're embedded within the wider Canadian context, but socially and emotionally, they're still rooted back home as well. And so I think culturally integrative thinks about when we're addressing issues like IPV or GBV, what is the starting point for this particular group? And what is the best starting point that makes it meaningful? And how do we engage with culture in this reality? And I want to talk about that a little bit because often culture, especially for Muslim or newcomer or Arabic speaking communities, has been seen as problematic. It's the source of the problem. And so culture is seen as the point of oppression and the point that becomes a point to lecture or to change. And so I think we really think about culture as working with and not against. You're working with where people are embedded. And all of us are embedded in culture. All of us are embedded within norms that are harmful, that reinforce violence, that reinforce GBV. And we're challenging those all the time. So there's multiple norms that exist within our Canadian society. That's also true for Muslim and newcomer Arabic speaking communities, that there are tensions there. And so I think culturally integrative is really locating yourself in that sort of messiness, recognizing, yes, there are ways that abuse or IPV is maybe is reinforced through particular norms, but there are also cultural ways in which it's already being challenged in ways people shift or reframe. And so it's working with that. And I think it's also when we were doing this program, recognizing the realities of Islamophobic narratives and how that impacted how we frame the program or how our other programs are developed and doing something different, but also recognizing how that impacts women. And so even when we did at the beginning, women in the group, one of the early questions was when we did a poll question is like, do you think, rates of abuse are higher in Muslim communities than other communities? Like, do you agree, disagree? You don't know. But a lot of women felt they agreed. And I think that is sort of an internalization of this wider narrative, Islamophobic rhetoric that sees newcomer communities importing problems of IPV or GBV. And so our work was also to work against that, as you'll see, sort of thinking about how do we locate, one of the things was thinking about naming and locating the reality of IPV in Canada for our participants and saying the rates aren't different. The rates, it looks different in different communities, but it's a problem in all communities. And so this was really important because women often had experiences attending other programs where they talked about feeling triggered or felt like people were talking to them. And I remember attending a few where often the tone was like, here in Canada, our laws indicate that, IPV is not permissible. It's against the law, and this is what happens. And so it really takes a tone of lecturing at rather than having conversations with. And that placed people in a situation where they felt defensive. And so I think those are the things that we need to challenge, that we intentionally challenged as we were developing this program, is sort of honoring the reality of their context, but also working against harmful and wider narratives that were Islamophobic and that position Muslim or Arabic and newcomer culture in sort of really monolithic or homogenous ways and in ways that are problematic and locating them as a source of the problem. Whereas, as Margarita said in the beginning, here in Canada, we have an issue with femicides, we have an issue with murdered and missing Indigenous women. And so the importance of locating IPV and GBV in Canada was also really important, and taking an approach to culturally integrative in that manner. Being really anti-oppressive and anti-racist. And so our starting point, we were really mindful of the tone and what our starting point was. So part of that tone was recognizing we're validating and affirming how people are joining us, and we're building this as a conversation. We're seeing you as someone who has a role to play in addressing IPV and supporting individuals who are experiencing IPV. We together create safe communities, and together we can be safe people for others, rather than placing them in a situation where they're being talked at as a potential victim or as a potential survivor. And so I think we really invited this as an opportunity to think of it as a leadership opportunity where we're here to learn and grow together and challenge one another. and really making clear sort of the why of the program. And the why of the program was thinking about the role that they could play. And so also early on in the first session, along with building group values, we talked about, who do we think people are most likely to turn to for help? And people identified, people turn to friends and family first, and in particular newcomer communities. And so I think that was a way of affirming that is a reality that we all recognize. And because it's a reality, all of us have the opportunity to play an important role and to recognize the knowledge and maybe skills that we can all build and strengthen in order to do that role well and to be a safe person for someone else who's experiencing abuse and who may disclose to us. The other piece, which sort of flows from this, is thinking then of having conversations that were really interactive and discussion based. And so we certainly had a curriculum prepared, we had slides prepared, but a lot of that, as Tahrid was showing earlier, was using strategies like poll questions, scenarios, or videos to really elicit their own perspectives, their experiences, their knowledge, their skills, and bringing that into the conversation. And then we would sort of build on that. And so it was really creating an intentional space where we affirmed the experiences and perspectives of people and really making it a conversation where all of us are here to learn. And I really mean that. Like, I think, Tahrid and I were reflecting, each group, I always took away a new learning because there were so many rich insights shared by our participants based on how they understood abuse, how they'd seen it play out in their families or in their communities, and offered really rich insights that actually came back to reinforce our program. They gave us a lot of ideas of how in future iterations, what kind of other questions should we have, or how do we switch the scenario a little bit? And so that was really important. And here's an example of something early on, and I wish I had a slide because I took screenshots to show when we use this in sessions of where women would place their X's of where do they agree or disagree. And so this was also something we talked about early on, but we wanted to make it safe for women to feel like their perspective mattered and that this wasn't about right or wrong, but that there's a context to why we position ourselves along this continuum. Maybe I'm closer to agree or maybe I'm closer to disagree, but there's reason why, and giving space for women to talk about that then, placing their X and then talking about, well, I placed it here because this is what I've come to know. And so that was a really important piece of how we started the groups and how we created a space to continue conversation and learning. Here again, as I talked before, we used examples or scenarios where we would put out a scenario thinking about, what form of abuse do you recognize here? This came later, but then we would listen. And this one was interesting because we're asking people to reflect on, what form of abuse. This is after having done some awareness of the different forms. A lot of women sometimes thought, yes, maybe psychological, but we'd also sometimes get economic, which was interesting. But in the discussion, we listen to what they have to offer, and then we might have things to strengthen that. So one of the key pieces in this scenario was thinking about how silent treatment is a form of abuse, and we may not think about it because we often think of abuse as something really forceful. And in this case, it's not forceful. It's something where, a behavior elicits a particular kind of response that is punishing, but it's not overtly punishing. And so I think it's then having them think about abuse, broadening or expanding their understanding of abuse or what it can look like through these discussions. Or using in discussions, really having opportunity for them to sort of offer responses. So within the story that we used, we would do this often through poll questions. We would say, we might ask a question, like in this instance, one of the character, is worried about her friend Netta, but why might she be afraid to say something about Netta or check in with her or open up a conversation if she's worried that she's experiencing abuse? And different groups, we would see different groups might, one group might lean a lot towards 3, another group might lean a lot towards 9 or number 10, but their responses gave us clues or indications of where to take the conversation and really follow their lead. And so I think in that way, it was really, I think structuring things in a conversational way really allowed us to work with where women were at and layer in sort of new learnings or expanding things as we were having these conversations and making it really participatory and interactive. As mentioned before, we made a lot of adaptations along the way. I think each session or each group provided us with new learnings. And that may have been to strengthen the flow of the sessions. It might have been to add in new content or strengthening content. And that may have come because women showed curiosity about, I want to better understand, like, what does it mean to support in these situations? Or like, what is the impact of abuse, like on survivors and victims? What is the impact on me or someone who's providing peer support? And so they gave us really good areas of interest that we then expanded upon or adapted and included in future groups and in future sessions. And we also really held, at the end of each session, held debrief sessions with members. We'd always ask, like, what is the key takeaway today, or what is a question you have? And that reflection back really allowed us to see where we were having impacts or where people were confused maybe in things or had questions, and that we might focus on again next week. And so I think it was really about responding to the needs of the group, thinking about, oh, we might need to spend a little bit more time on understanding forms of abuse or on this particular form of abuse before moving forward. And so we were really adaptive along the way. One of the key areas, as Tahrid already indicated earlier, was thinking about the continuum of relationships. So after the first pilot, we recognized at the end that as we were wrapping up the program, a lot of people still had questions about, like, but what is the difference between conflict and abuse? Or, like, we would have scenarios and people would say, but is this abuse? And so still had questions. And then we added in a session where we thought, like, oh, let's talk about the continuum of relationships. And that really helped clarify things for that group. But it also showed us, actually, that really needs to move to the front of the program. Like, that needs to be a starting point. Building in the awareness that there is a continuum of relationships, and how do these relationships differ? How do we recognize the differences between these? What are the patterns? What does it feel like to be in a healthy relationship? What does it feel like to be in an abusive relationship? And how do we recognize the difference between patterns of conflict versus patterns of abuse? What is the impact of abuse in terms of feeling a lack of safety, feeling harm, feeling fear, versus conflict, where there's maybe a pattern where there's a dynamic of fights repeating themselves, maybe some escalation, but there's harm, but really trying to tease out the differences. And we created a new graphic, which I forgot to include, but that was a really key piece that I think strengthened people's awareness of recognizing abuse and really contextualizing abuse as, sort of not singular incidents, but also patterns, and being able to distinguish it from conflict.
I just want to add one thing for this slide, Yasmin. I remember we did an exercise where we have list of words and we asked the participant to place them on the continuum. Like, let's say disagreement, like, where do you think disagreement happen? And then they can realize it can happen in all forms of relationship. Jealousy also, like, created a lot of great discussion in the groups. Like, where you feel sad sometimes, or like your feelings were hurt. So I think, like, this exercise was really helpful to identify that sometimes we have to take a closer look at the pattern, the intensity, and the frequency of abuse to say this is an abusive relationship.
I think that's really key. And in particular, key words like jealousy, where people thought, like, actually, it's healthy. It is part of a healthy relationship. But when does jealousy become controlling? And so I think really having conversations around that, and especially when there are sort of sometimes a value of, like, oh, but jealousy can be an indication of love. So unpacking some of that, and so I think recognizing what one word could look like across all three, but what are we looking for that distinguishes jealousy as healthy versus jealousy as abusive? So thank you for that, Tahrid, for that reminder.
So in this section, we will touch base on how we created a safe space for participation and learning for women. So one of the main things is language. So whenever anyone wants to create a program like really similar to what we've done, I would recommend taking a look at language, because it's not about translation or interpretation. It took us like a lot of discussion between me and Yasmin, what language do we want to use? So sometimes Yasmin asks me, like, is there a translation in Arabic to, let's say, gender-based violence or IPV? I say yes, but do we want to use this in the sessions? we sometimes say no because like this language could be used in research, academic work, maybe articles, but not like in the daily life of women, or not in a gathering, or not like while they discussing and a case of IPV that they learned about in the community. So it's not a word-to-word translation. Like we looked at the cultural expression, even in scenarios, questions, discussion, whatever. So integrating language with respect to diverse participant literacy levels. So we had women who speaks Arabic but doesn't maybe read Arabic necessarily. So we adapt that by maybe sometimes reading aloud, sometimes supporting them even after the sessions. So we adjusted the curriculum based on the needs of each participant, not each group. And I remember sometimes we could make things different from morning group to afternoon group. So it's always been in developing process. Okay. So also we invested a lot in relationship with women. We responded to the need of each group, as I said. Also, we responded to the needs of individuals. So we usually do check-ins, like let's say after each session, we felt a participant, like maybe we felt she's triggered, like we check in with her, follow up with her. Like sometimes we feel like a woman is quiet and this is not her normal thing. So we check in and see like if she was triggered, if she needs support. Sometimes, as I said, like we figure it out that it might be because of language stuff. So we adapt those over the way. So also like some women in some sensitive topics, I remember, let's say if like they have a question about sexual abuse and they are really shy to ask. So we offer like, you can send me a direct message or put your question in the chat box, then I can read it aloud without saying your name. So we just to encourage them to speak out and maybe ask questions. Also like all the, like within those 3 years, many things were happening in Middle East. And we know that women were really impacted in those, whether it's the earthquake in Turkey, what's going on in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, their home countries. So we always like check in with women and just check on their sense of safety because they are really impacted, especially that they have family members there. Sometimes we decided to cancel some sessions, reschedule others, just to make sure that they're ready for this topic because it's a heavy topic, talking about GBV, and not easy. So we want to make sure that they are ready to that. Also, we adjusted sessions based on their timelines. If there's a PD days, because everyone has kids, religious days, prayer time, we avoided doing anything on Fridays because we have the prayer for Muslims. So it didn't really work for women. Okay, so you understand us. Maybe this is the most statement that I have heard like in the sessions from women, either at the beginning of their conversation or at the end of a question. So when they say, you understand me or you understand us, they meant that it's not about language, like, or maybe speaking the same language as them. I understand their fears. I understand their concerns, the context of choices. Let's say we put a scenario and they choose to do whatever the scenario is suggesting. And then we say, you understand us, we can't do this because of traditions, for culture, for social pressure. So I think this was a key in our program, and we took this in consideration while developing the curriculum and the content, because that resonates with them, especially when we took this into the scenarios and stories where we shared with them. Okay, so I'll jump into the next one. So I'll give you an example. This one is one of the scenarios we used in the group about the like women telling a victim of abuse, a woman experience abuse, you should be patient and pray more. This is a test from Allah or from God. So this created lot of discussion around maybe the statement of the word or the understanding of patient. Like they use religion sometimes in the conversation. They use also like cultural context or why they say that. Sometimes they admit it, like, okay, this is really common. Everyone say that in the community. And people said, okay, I say that, but now we can challenge ourselves because we show them the impact of saying this to a victim of abuse. So as Yasmin shared that always this program was in a development process, we have growing edges, we facilitated and created space that invited a critical reflection. So we don't challenge women like or put them on defensive. We rather show them the impact of what they could say or comment on certain scenarios. And when they say this, like see this impact, they could challenge themselves, but also like we had moments where they challenge each other. Especially I remember like few things about sexual abuse. They stretched their knowledge, awareness, and perspective on abuse, different forms of abuse. They could name the tactics, they could recognize red flags. Also, they could at sometimes rethink about the norms. So we didn't necessarily invited them directly. Okay, we have this statement. We have to rethink about that. No, we led them like through the conversation to a place where they can see the impact of victim blaming, minimizing abuse, normalizing abuse, and then there where they convinced, okay, I want to change what I'm saying because now I can see the impact of what I'm saying. Here is a slide of the 6 forms of abuse that we usually use while introducing forms of abuse. And me and Yasmin, when we were building this sheet, we wanted to focus on what is abuse beyond what is known. So let's say physical abuse. Everyone know that physical abuse is just maybe hitting. And we say, no, like this is beyond that. It could be confining the victim, let's say. Also for spiritual abuse, economic abuse, sexual abuse, there is maybe a few common understanding in the community around those forms, but we expanded on what maybe they are missing. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, Yasmin. Maybe we can share a few of those examples.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to build on because I think the growing edges was key. Like I think in terms of like really creating a space where people could critically reflect and through questions thinking about like what would be the impact of this kind of statement or how would someone feel or thinking about as Tahrid said, abuse in more broad ways. And so one of the, and we always had good discussions. And so this was also a really good discussion. This is from a video. We used a video that Nisa Holmes created a few years ago. It's in Arabic, so it worked really well, but it's positioned around the story of Noor and how she accessed Nisa Holmes. So it was a way also to talk about or raise awareness of the reality of different services and supports and the reality of, Muslim women's shelters existing across the country. But in the story, she talked about how, her husband had this perfect image, it's the story that was created in this video has this perfect image as in the community because he volunteers at the mosque and is always helping and is an amazing friend. And so we really talked about the idea of reputation, thinking about like, how does that impact Noor? If she were to disclose that she's experiencing abuse, do you think she would be believed or disbelieved? And again, like, people respond in different ways. Like, there might be, 30% of the group said, well, if I'm her close friend, I would believe her. But then others really recognize, well, a lot of people may not believe her because they see her husband. And so then we talked about how, the use of reputation, how does that continue to isolate or silence someone in Noor's position? And how is it used strategically? And so I remember, one participant really highlighting that, saying that a lot of times reputation is used to really in purposeful ways so that it makes it hard for someone to think something else or to even have Noor to feel like she even has space to talk about who she is and her experience. And so those things were really great growing edges, but there were such collaborative conversations. And so that's just an example. Like we just wanted to highlight some examples of the ways we would approach it. This was another tool we use. It's a video, and actually it's a form of theater video that we created with a group of youth for another project a few years ago. But it works really well. It's a story of Amna, like a woman who's recently married. And in the story, you see her husband. You also meet her mom and her sister. And the mom, it's clear there are problems in the marriage. And so this is a scene between the mom and the daughter. And the mom is really telling her, you know, your marriage is young. You have to figure out a way to work with your husband. And so we talked about like, what is this doing for Amna? Like, in what ways does this either minimize, does this victim blame, does this normalize abuse? What is happening here? And then really thinking through the impacts of statements, and then also really practicing with groups like, what could the mom be saying differently? Like, what would that script sound like? How could the mom, like, what does the mom need to be doing in terms of supporting her daughter, in terms of both actions, maybe in terms of listening, but also then in terms of follow-up statements. And so it created a really good opportunity to have discussions, hear from different people, but then also practice as a group in terms of thinking of different scripts. And sometimes it was interesting, as Tahrid said earlier, we might practice things and we might say, you know, how can you challenge victim blaming, both one-on-one in terms of when you're supporting someone who discloses, but also in community settings, because issues like this are talked about. Say there's, you know, sort of gossip or a situation that's being talked about in the community. How could you maybe challenge harmful norms? And so we brought those kind of conversations into the group as well. And women were honest. Some women would say, I would feel comfortable sort of challenging someone if someone said, oh, she must have done something, or, you know, for this to happen. I feel like I could challenge. But other women were honest and said it would be hard to challenge in a group because this is your new community and you want to belong, and you have to be maybe careful about when you voice things and to whom. And that's fair. And so we wouldn't ever shame that. We would really just, we would acknowledge the challenges of maybe challenging your community on issues. And so I think that's what made it also a really safe space for people. And again, sort of really thinking always, as Tahrid said, thinking about impacts and thinking about impacts over intentions, and locating themselves in these situations. So again, in this situation, what does it feel like for Linda in this moment, sort of identifying those impacts, but also what does it feel like for you if you're witnessing this? And what are you carrying? And then what can you do in those moments or afterwards? And what does that look like? So these were some of the ways we sort of created space for different kinds of conversation, both recognizing what they're seeing in terms of happening here, again, naming the abuse, but then thinking about the responses and what support might be in this moment or following. So we really, like I was talking about, we really wanted to create a space for people to practice and walk away with not only new knowledge or awareness of what intimate partner violence is, what abuse looks like, what it sounds like, and reflecting critically on our norms, but also thinking about what it means to practically support someone who might be experiencing abuse or who discloses to you. And so we really worked hard over this, also had many iterations over a period of time. So this looks vastly different now than it did in our first pilot. And it was a lot of collaborative work, both in terms of, you know, getting feedback from women in the group, Tahrid, myself, but other colleagues at MRC who also really played a huge part in shaping this. We have the acknowledgements at the end, but Najla Kanan and Afnan Al-Musnad were really key in helping to co-develop this as well. And it's the 5 alifs. So the alif is the letter A, stands for the letter A in Arabic. And so in Arabic, all these 5 points start with a version of an alif. And so it makes it easy to remember. But this was, again, creating a tool rooted in principles of peer support that are trauma-informed, but culturally integrative, that provided people with a guide of how to support someone who might be experiencing abuse or disclose. And we would practice this. We went through this to talk about what does this look like in practice and what does it sound like in practice. And so I think, Tahrid, I think I'm returning this over to you.
Thank you. So I think when we reframed or introduced the 5 alifs, everyone came to the session or to the program thinking that maybe supporting someone is fixing the problem or solving the problem. So they came to us with this pressure on their shoulders. So sometimes they're worried like to destroy the family or maybe making things worse. So when we introduced the 5 alifs, I think, and we have a sense that it lifts this pressure from their shoulders, that now we can support, but we don't have to solve the problem, take decision on behalf of the victim or fix anything. So we provided a list of key principles and break them down into scenarios, practice a lot. We spent 2 sessions here and we show how 5 alifs might sound or look like. let's say like the first alif is listen, so istama in Arabic. So we say like, we had many women said like at the beginning that we wanna, maybe I need to understand both sides, I need to have more information. So everyone said like at the beginning, when someone disclose abuse to them, they start asking questions. We want to understand the story, then we can offer a good advice. We said no, like you have to open a safe space to listen to women. You can ask questions, but you can't, maybe you can ask, how can I help you, what do you need at that moment, but you can't ask like when this happened, or like how is he hitting you or not. And also like I remember this statement, we heard lot of this repeating again in our groups, I need to understand both sides or hear from both sides. We said you can do this in a conflict, but not in a case of abusive relationship. Okay, and also we practiced a lot. What would you do if a woman, let's say, call you and ask you she wanna come to your house? How would you respond to that? I think this created a lot of discussion because for cultural reason, like sometimes women said, or like admit that we can't say no because this is could be really a big thing in our community. And we started asking them question like, do you feel this is safe for you? Do you feel like this is the best option of safest option for her? And then the conversation came, and then they realized, okay, maybe this is not the best thing to do at the moment, and we have different options, and we can, maybe if we can't do one thing, we can offer another thing to do. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you to this scenario, Yasmin.
Perfect. I just want to go back to this one briefly because this was a really big discussion. I think as Tahrid said, culturally, maybe people feel if someone asks you, people felt like, oh, you can't say no, even if you feel like I'm not comfortable saying yes. And so we really talked about how to expand people's options of like, you can still be there and support a friend, but what might it sound like if you're not comfortable? How can you sort of have that conversation, but still center the fact that you're there for her and you're concerned about her safety? And we also talked, it might look different in different situations. Like women said, you know, if it were my sister, I would say yes, but if it were a friend, I might say no. Absolutely valid. And people sometimes shared their experiences of, you know, when they had supported someone and maybe where it had gone well, or sometimes when it hadn't gone well. And so I think that really created an opportunity to think through, like, what are you thinking through for yourself in that moment in terms of what's important for you and your family, and what are the options available? And again, practicing scripts or thinking about what that might sound like. And, you know, one of the other ones was people that often came up, people had been, what we discovered over the course of the program is that often women in the groups were supporting someone who's experiencing abuse, whether it's a friend here, often too, it might have been a sister back home. And they talked about, you know, I've listened, I've given my advice, I've shared, but sometimes they don't take it and found that frustrating. And so again, we sort of reframe that, you know, our role isn't necessarily to give advice, but that support really focuses on thinking about what is it, how can we support what the person identifies as important to them and what they need and what's within their capacity? Because we may think, you know, it's easy to take these certain steps and it might not feel like a big step, but it feels like a giant step for someone who's in that situation, or it may not be possible. And this also opened up the opportunity to think about trauma and trauma impacts and recognizing the different contexts and barriers that survivors might experience. And again, reframing that, you know, it's hard. Sometimes it's a long-term process being there for someone who's experiencing abuse, because it's not so easy for survivors often to change their situation of abuse for various reasons. And I think women highlighted or understood that too, but it brought these things into the conversation and helped reframe what their role might be or what it would look like, and some of the challenges that come with the role of supporting someone who's offering peer support to a loved one or a friend. And so this is sort of, we always said, you know, the goal, this is from a resource. We'll talk more about the different resources, but this one is providing a guide on, like, if you're concerned about someone, what are some steps or how can you check in? But I think we always emphasize the goal is for her to feel safe, not necessarily to open up. And so she may not be ready to share everything, and that's okay. She'll share in different pieces, and she can sort of draw her boundaries of what she's comfortable sharing or not. But your goal is to accept what she's sharing with you and to listen and to move from there and to validate what she shared with you, to believe that, and focus on what you can do to help her feel safer and to help her feel more supported. And this sort of also then led into a conversation that, yes, the safety of the person you're supporting is important, but your well-being and safety as someone who's providing support also matters. And I think this was a really important addition and something that participants really in a lot of the latter groups really, when we did debriefs, came to value because, as mentioned, many of them had been in situations where they were offering support. And so I think we talked about like, what does it feel like to offer support? How are you impacted emotionally? And bringing that into the conversation and recognizing that, having conversations about being able to think about what is our capacity for support. And my level of support may look different from yours, and support can look many different ways. And there's instrumental support. If you find it taxing to listen to someone share experiences of abuse because maybe it triggers something in your own experiences, how can you share that or reframe that gently back? And how can you also identify how you're able to be there or have a conversation about what support then looks like? And so I think those were really important conversations to have with the group as well that felt really practical and also validating and affirming for everyone. I don't know, Tafrid, if you wanted to add to this or at all.
No, I think everything is well covered. Just like two quick things. We felt that maybe integrating some trauma-informed approach to the program and also validating and acknowledging like their fears, why they are hesitant to support someone or to check in someone, like what are the feelings that they might feel like while supporting a beloved one, whether they are here or back home. I felt like this conversation was really a new aspect for them because every time maybe like everyone focus on what the victim is feeling, but no one maybe focus on what they are feeling, which was really important to them.
Absolutely. And I think too, even in the scenarios, we presented scenarios that often weren't perfect, but we also presented scenarios where someone is maybe saying or responding in a great way. And we had people identify, what do you think they're doing well here? Which of the 5 Alifs do you see working really well? And again, it provided people with scripts or saying like, oh, I really like the way in this scenario, this character, affirmed that, oh, the abuse someone was experiencing, or liked how she framed that she believed her. And so I think that's also important to recognize too, because I think we shared a lot of the scenarios or situations where we sort of found sort of growing edges in. In terms of program impacts, we've been fortunate that we've been able to do an external evaluation with Kovacs Group. They're actually just working on a final report now. So we have various surveys and focus groups and a post-evaluation survey that they're working on. Hopefully we have that to share soon. But I'll leave it to Tahri to share some of the impacts we've already been able to identify.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick thing on like the post-evaluation survey. Like we had women who has been part of the program like for 3 years. After 3 years, they have been part of this survey, which was really like important to us to see like the outcome of the program itself. So you can see a few stats from our final results. Like 90% of women has identified that they or reported that they have now high level of understanding of what is domestic abuse and that they feel better prepared to identify warning signs, red flags of abuse. And 92 agree that they feel better prepared to provide support. And around 80% feel confident in their ability to support someone who might disclose abuse to them. So we have many quotes in the final report, but maybe what resonate more with me, and Yasmin, you can talk to your part, that people were able to name abuse. And I felt like this is really important to them. I remember one time a woman said that naming the problem is half of the solution for her. So they can sometimes look at maybe look at a past experience in different lenses now and feel like they are validated and feel like, okay, I experienced that in the past, I can name it. I remember one woman shared, like, I was experiencing economic abuse and didn't know until I have been part of the program. Also, like many of them said, like, usually when we start supporting someone, we start with questions, and we avoided that after attending the program. Here are some themes, for what changed for participants as a result of attending the program. For, of course, increased knowledge, gaining ability to recognize different forms. But I feel like the most important thing, feeling more confident and empowered to support victims of abuse. Because as we said, like many of them were supporting or maybe in a position to support someone. So they felt more empowered after attending the sessions. Okay, so some closing reflections. Many women, in the program, said that during the program, they felt that they have a voice, they have a place where they can create opinions, their own opinions around things without being influenced or feel pressure to maybe take a certain point of view, which was really important to them. Also, the program was an informal channel for women to ask for help for themselves or for their beloved ones. So we had many messages, sometimes phone calls, saying that, okay, like I'm supporting someone, what should I do at that moment? Like my friend needs help. What can we offer for her? So I think maybe those are really important reflections in our learning journey throughout the program.
Absolutely. Like I think I mean, I think there were a lot of surprises along the way, but I think the informal pathway was a key one. I think people did reach out and say, I'm my sister, even if they're back home, like what can I do? And recognizing the context of supporting someone who is not in Canada is very different than to supporting someone here. People would connect us to a friend or say, can I give your number or to a friend to contact you. And so I think those were really important opportunities of providing and continuing to create a pathway, but provide informal support. And those relationships still exist. And I think it also led to women sort of identifying we're interested in learning more. And so, at the end of sort of some of this, one of the earlier groups, like I think groups 3 to 5, women said, well, we're interested in now understanding this and this. And so we created, part 2 to the program to understand this social service landscape and what do shelters do and how do you access a shelter and sort of answering some of the questions that they had. And so we really appreciated just the level of engagement and also sort of the contributions women made to sort of identify, well, what's our next step? What are we doing next in terms of learning more? And so I think we really appreciated just that level of commitment and that level of engagement and that level of interest in wanting to learn more and to have more knowledge and to have more awareness and skills. This is quickly a graphic. It's not perfect and it's also a little bit messed up, but as Tawhid and I were talking, we're thinking about how do you capture some of how these women were positioned in their location. It's like they're not quite overlapping, but it's like she's in Canada, and so she's in Canada here in this family. They're living in a new community, and so that impacts maybe how they're responding to situations of abuse or the stories they're hearing. And so that plays a role, but it also creates opportunities because they're supporting people, often friends and family here as well. But then that's also embedded within sort of the wider Canadian society and institutions in terms of thinking about what is possible in terms of supports or access or what are the barriers they may experience. And at the same time, a lot of what they're holding is things from back home or how they're making sense of what's possible. Like I think even as they're thinking about decisions for themselves here, they're also engaged with family back home still. Family back home is not absent from their lives here. What's happening in their countries of origin is not absent from their lives here. And I think that's really important to remember, not only in terms of the context that they're supporting people practically, maybe who are back home financially, but also emotionally who might be experiencing abuse, but even as they're thinking about what's possible for them and their role in Canada and the kind of voice they have or what actions they choose for themselves is very much influenced by what's happening back home. It's just, I don't know, it's still rough, but I don't know, maybe it's helpful or not. I think visually sometimes, and this is sort of what came up. we also talked about sort of some of the resources we're working on and creating. And so we've been creating sort of one, like, is it abuse? So it's a series of 6 sort of culturally informed resources supporting women and girls, Muslim women and girls, to identify their experiences of abuse within intimate partner or family relationships. And we have sort of short versions like this one where you see, is it economic abuse? And then we also have longer versions. And a lot of it is thinking about being able to recognize abuse, identifying some tactics, thinking about the impacts people might experience if you were in that situation. And in the longer versions, we also talk about what a healthy relationship free of that kind of abuse might look like, and also provide a list of supports. So in the longer versions, this is the cover, but again, we have more affirmations. We also look to faith, to our faith, that in order to sort of remove any justification for this form of abuse, what does it say in our faith in terms of your right to be in relationships where you hear loving words and gentle words and where there's a lack of violence and abuse. And then the other resources are these 3. It's a series of 3 thinking about supporting her safety. So how you check in, a tool specifically dedicated to the 5 Alifs, and then also one thinking about how you provide peer support and what does it look like to balance the care you're providing to someone else along with the care you're providing to yourself. And so again, this is sort of what it looks like a little bit. We have some tips and some practical strategies, and they're being created both in English and in Arabic to share. They're in process, so we hope to have them to share soon. And hopefully we'll share them with the Learning Network for sure, so that they can be provided to everyone. We'll have electronic and print versions in both languages. And before we end it, we'd just like to sort of give some acknowledgement to others who, along with the many women who were part of this journey with us, who Tahrid and I hold such gratitude for, but also other acknowledgements of people who provided either facilitation support with the groups throughout along the way, or to help create some of the resources with us. I don't know, Tahrid, before, if there's anything else you want to add.
No, just like quick thing about the resources that they will be launched soon, and we will share them with the learning network, but also like that those resources are for anyone, any community member can read. We make it really simple. We work like very hard on the language, both in Arabic and English, to make it accessible for anyone.
Right.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Thank you so much. And you're going to see in the chat that people are really looking forward to those resources, and you're getting a lot of positive feedback. That was a really excellent presentation. So thank you so much for walking us through the Supporting Her Safety program, the curriculum, the impacts. Can see really your thoughtful approach in all of this work. It's really evident. And I liked the distinction you were making as well between, creating this kind of culturally integrative programs versus universal ones that might adapt. And I really appreciate also the emphasis on language and what that means in this work. It's really clear that the project is also shaped by like a deep understanding of cultural nuances, and I see really also really strong facilitation skills from both of you as well. So we're going to move our way into the Q&A time now. And so we have a few questions that have been submitted, and I welcome those who are in the audience to continue to submit your questions into the Q&A so we have an opportunity to connect directly with our speakers. So one of the questions that we received says, thank you very much for presenting such impactful work. I understand that the sessions were conducted virtually. Would you talk about how you made sure safety for women attending virtually as opposed to in-person sessions, and what were some of the challenges and how did you address them?
That's a great question. Tahrid, I don't know if you want to start or...
Yeah, go ahead and I can
add. Good at.
Yeah.
That is something we definitely did in one of the first sessions we talked about, like as we created just even safe guidelines for the group of how we work together, but we also specifically addressed sort of creating safety virtually. So we talked about recognizing the sensitivity of the topic and that people were sharing their perspectives and sometimes personal stories, and to be mindful of, if you're in your room, who's in the room with you, or, to not have anybody in the room, because we wanted to protect everybody's confidentiality. And that was something that was important to all group members as well. And they identified that. And so really identifying that when you're joining us, join from a place where you're safe, but that's also private, because people, we don't want others to be listening into what other women in the community may be sharing, especially if people recognize names, but they're not part of the program. And so I think that was something that was really important. We did often at the beginning, we always started with cameras on. That was sometimes, I think a lot of participants were really great. There were also often situations where people said, oh, I can't have my camera on today, but I'm listening. And it would be great if people shared with us in advance as to why or why not they couldn't have their camera on. Or sometimes if they shared with us, I'm listening privately, but I'm in the waiting room at a doctor's office, but they would have their headphones on. Like it was sometimes like we would get sort of like really interesting sort of messages from women sometimes about how they were joining us and where. But that was something we really talked about in the beginning, and really wanted to be mindful, and often brought it up again. Sometimes if we noticed that, okay, like we're sort of wondering if other people are in the room, like we would bring it up just as gentle reminders. I don't know, Tafid, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, it just remind me like because women would join us. Like one time we had a woman join us from the maternity room. She just gave birth, and we were totally surprised she was there. Yeah, so they were really committed, like joining sometimes from cars, from clinics, but also like over the time they learned that those spaces are really safe and for them and for others. So one common thing, like I felt like we had over the way that women could have guests like as a surprise, like one time, like in Arab community, people would relate to that. They just knock and come in, and like we noticed that women could stay in Zoom session. Then we asked them, and they practiced that over time. That if you have guests, just send me a message, and I'm okay to leave. Until the moment yesterday, we had a session, and one woman said, "Okay, I have guests, like I will leave now." So I think over the time also we said you can share information, but you can't share experiences. Like talking about in the groups. Also, no screenshots, no names, because
Mhm.
some women didn't want anyone to know that they are attending this program. So yeah, those what
Yeah.
I can remember now.
No, for sure. I think we really asked what safety looked like for them. And I think the screenshot rule was a big one too.
Mm.
And that was something even women brought up too. Like sometimes they would bring up for themselves, like, no, like they would ask us, we're certainly not recording. And so, they would ask people not to take screenshots or not to take images. And so I think they really identified what was really important to them around safety virtually as well. And
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. That's really important, and I also think it speaks to people's level of commitment, hearing that they were connecting wherever they might be as well. So there's a question from someone that want to know where, like, what website can people visit to learn more about this project and access the resources?
So I can maybe put MRC website in the chat box, but also like again, like we will be launching the resources very soon. They can contact us on the emails, Yasmin, if maybe, I don't know if you can still have access to those.
Mhm.
Okay,
Great.
yeah,
Thank you.
no worries.
Also, a question here is, your project highlights the importance of cultural integration and the context that you were referring to, and we can see it also reflected in your case examples and your narratives. And just curious if you could maybe speak to the process in developing those case examples. And I believe you mentioned something about like a graphic novel, if I'm not mistaken, that you shared. So just wanted to learn a little bit more about that process. And then thinking about, this is a longer question, but maybe thinking about people who we've got such a positive response about the resources and people wanting to use the resources, but anything to consider, because it sounds like a really thoughtful process, and the things that you set up and you lay out in the beginning, things for people to consider if they are planning to use those resources as well in their community.
Well, I can speak to the scenarios like usually like when we prepare scenarios, me and Yasmin had a meeting and had a lot of discussion what might maybe resonate for women either for language, for cases. Sometimes, like we say, let's say about immigration cases, someone is threatening his wife, like to maybe send her back home. And we know this is quite common. Sometimes we use like a man prevent his woman from going to English school. We know this is really common in our community. So we focused on what we know is really common and what would resonate with women. I think, Yasmin, you can speak for Salama's story because they were part of past groups before I joined MRC. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to add to Tahrir's point, like, I mean, I think, I worked in the sort of the area of GBV for many years within Muslim communities doing community education. And so you get a sense of like, what are some of the situations or scenarios, or what are some of the norms that we're really confronting that are maybe a little bit stickier or trickier. And I think Tahrir has, had experience working in Lebanon and can really relate to what it means to move to a new country and the newcomer experience. And that was always really powerful, thinking about, this program, is for newcomer Arabic speaking women. And it may look different if it were for a group of Muslim women who are third generation. There might be some similarities, but there would also be differences. So really thinking about the uniqueness of the population we're working with. And so some of the resources were created earlier, like the Salama story was also a project, again, with young women, thinking about how do we begin to raise awareness. And it was a short graphic story around, moments of like, when do you notice abuse, but what do you say as a friend? Like, so it was sort of left as a story of like, what would you do if this is you? And sort of really inviting people in to take a step in. And then we were able to translate it into Arabic with Tahrid, who did the translation, and use it within this group. And same with the Farm Theater video. We had a project, in earlier years with young people thinking about scripts of family violence and IPV in our community, and sort of workshopping with community members sometimes a lot of these scenarios or stories and situations, and using them within that program in particular, because it was about creating theater scripts, but then using it in future programs. But in a way, also, like, women give us ideas in the conversations. So we have content, but in future groups, we might be like, it was really interesting that this woman brought up this kind of situation or scenario, and it seemed to really resonate with the group, and we hadn't thought of it. And then it becomes integrated into a future session.
Thank you.
I don't know if we missed part of the question because you said there were multiple parts I couldn't remember.
Well, there was a part there just thinking about other groups who might want to use these resources or bring these resources into their community. And so I heard you outline such a thoughtful process in terms of talking about context and meeting people where they're at, and kind of um, what might you suggest there when other groups are using the resources in terms of using it from the beginning to the end and going through it, and not just necessarily highlighting maybe the case examples or stories, but walking through more of the full package of those resources?
Yeah. I think we're also inspired by the really wonderful work that exists out in community, because so many communities are doing such tremendous and thoughtful and innovative work. And so I think if and hopefully we have a package that we can share as part of a curriculum. I think people know their communities well. And so there is an element of adaptation, but I think it's really beyond just adapting it culturally, but adapting it to the community you're working with, and knowing your expertise and knowledge you have of, we're thinking of this group in this city with this particular population. And so what are some of the dynamics we're seeing here within this group? And what does it look like to create safety and trust those relationships? I think a lot of the work wouldn't resonate as much as it does if we didn't have some of the relationships within the community through other prior projects or other work or existing connections. I think that really helps to build that sort of level of knowledge. And so I think people would, use it, and then people know how it makes sense for them in the community that they're working with.
Thank you, Yasmin. That's really helpful. Moving on to some other questions from participants. Someone says here, awesome presentation. Research shows that spirituality, religious beliefs can lead to better mental health outcomes. However, when spiritual abuse is part of a relationship, it can have totally opposite impact. Some of the Muslim Arab women experiencing IPV share that they do not want to be a part of the religion as their abuser used religion to justify abuse. My question is, are there any resources for these women that provide short-term spiritual counseling and perhaps options that are at no charge?
So maybe we can share the resources, but also like at MRC, we usually had Imam Abdel Fattah Tawakkul who could support women. And we had a series of Jum'ah khutbas for him, or Jum'ah speeches, talking about also spiritual abuse. At the moment, also, we are offering at MRC series of sessions speaking about this topic.
And I would say for women, I think it is really impactful if someone's experiencing spiritual abuse. Like when we talk about all abuse is harmful, but if it's something that people are powerfully connected to their relationship with a spiritual creator, and then spiritual abuse is used as a controlling pattern to interrupt that, to minimize or to destroy that relation, to destroy that relationship of peace or a larger relationship of connection with someone, it is deeply impactful. And I think in terms of just support for women out there, and again, I would urge, like, think about, is someone who is doing spiritual counseling the a first step, or is it someone who is really able to validate and affirm the way spiritual abuse has impacted someone? So there is counseling available at organizations like the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration. Nisa Homes also provides counseling and support for women, as does Sakina Homes. And I think they recognize the context of women and recognize the unique relationship of particular that spiritual abuse has and how that plays out, and what is some of the repair or healing work after abuse that needs to happen, or how it can happen. Like, it doesn't, not necessarily how it needs to happen, but what it might look like for someone, and finding the appropriate supports and resources for someone.
Thank you both. There's also a question here that says, I really liked how you looked at asking questions like, is this abuse? Curious, is there a partner program focused on engaging men in this conversation from a prevention perspective and building allies, especially with some of the cultural dynamics?
I think we started, me and Yasmin, in the past, a pilot group with men. Unfortunately, that work was stopped, but we touched on them, like maybe few things about the relationship and dynamics within family. We started the conversation from that point, their fears as new immigrants as well.
Yeah, I think there's much more work and opportunity in that area, actually, and is an area that I think is important to explore and important to do. Like, I will say, even when we were doing these groups, sometimes in the focus groups, one of the questions was like, did you share your experience in this program with other people? And it was interesting because sometimes there were women who said, oh, I shared my experience with my husband. And so one woman explicitly shared, like, after our session each week, I would basically facilitate the session you facilitated with us with my husband. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And a few other women, we talked about, like, did you share with your husband? Some women said no, they wouldn't know how to start. But we were then thinking about, like, is there a group of men, like Tahrid said, we did try to pilot, like, is there a group of men who'd be willing, who'd be open to trying? And I think building on that absolutely is important. Like in the past, MRC had a program too with young newcomer or racialized men where we did violence prevention work, which was also really powerful and was really great. Like, I felt like they were really engaged and open, and again, using very interactive strategies. And I think when you're doing this work with men, I think the starting point, again, thinking about, like as Tahrid hinted at, what is the starting point for this work? I think any program with men would also have to start with the starting point of, like, what has your experience been moving to a new country? Because I think it comes with challenges, and it comes with a lot of fears. It comes with a lot of new stressors, different kinds of responsibilities. And men often feel vulnerable in moving to a new country as well. And so creating space for that, and then thinking about sort of the context of relationships, again, starting with, when we were mapping this out, thinking about, like, the continuum of relationships and being sort of starting from there. And I think so it wouldn't be a direct adaptation or translation of the work we did with women. I think that was something we thought about, like, how does it need to look different in a way that allows men also to step into the conversation and stay in the conversation?
Hmm. Really, really valuable points. I like how you ended there and to stay in the conversation. There's also a question here about, as both of you as facilitators, what might have been some of your facilitating strategies? Also, if you consider that participants might be relatives or friends.
Yeah, we had one group like where they all relatives, but the dynamics were really interesting in that. Actually, we put a lot of energy in creating discussion within those groups. Like I know the curriculum is important, the scenarios is important, exercises, but lot of priority for discussion, like where we created discussions. Like I remember, like when we feel someone is maybe quiet, like we try to engage them in different ways just to make sure everyone is on the same page, because discussion took like scenarios for different places and open up for different things like we were surprised with.
And I would say, like, I mean, some groups it was clear that there were a lot of friends in the group, and sometimes that added good energy or safety. But I also know, like, from in another situation, someone who maybe then felt silenced, who wasn't as comfortable sharing, because maybe then the concern was like, I don't know if then, the other relative would share something with their husband, and then that gets back to, so they were careful about how they participated and what they shared in groups. So I think it can be a both and in terms of like, it can be great in terms of creating a sense of like, already there are relationships in place, but it can also maybe hinder people's participation as well. And sort of being mindful of that, or adjust the way they choose to participate, or that they're more cautious about how they participate.
Thank you. There's also a question here that's related to recruitment and outreach of participants for the program. So just a question in terms of what might have been your strategy for recruitment and outreach for participants in the program, um, and a consideration that sometimes maybe coordinators for programs may not want to announce it as a group that will focus on family violence, or
Mm.
or name it that they're talking about violence so directly. Is there anything related maybe to the messaging or the language that you might have used that might be helpful for others to consider in terms of your recruitment and outreach strategy?
Yeah, for sure, the title was something key, like
Mm.
being away from saying domestic abuse or violence, and maybe focusing more about like this is a peer leader program supporting others or supporting her safety. For the promotion pieces, I think Yasmin touched on like how we build trust over time with women, and it becomes like a snowball, like growing and growing. People would recommend their friends, their neighbors, their colleagues at school or jobs to join us, like based on the trust and also based what they know about this program. So because many of women had like this idea or stigmatized joining to program about domestic abuse for many reasons, and when they know like what we build, what is our approach, and maybe we didn't share this, but this program is not built for anyone who is experiencing abuse. We're
Mm.
not asking people to share their experience of abuse. We focus more that like you're here to learn more about abuse and how to support someone who is experiencing abuse.
Mhm. I think that is key, because I think a lot of people, I think the promotion of it as a leadership opportunity, a peer leader, piqued people's interest, and framing it that way, that we're here to learn and build skills, I think was key. And I think even at the first session, as Tafid said, we were always really clear that this is a program not about sharing personal stories of abuse. In fact, it really isn't a program designed for survivors, in that way. It's meant for people who are at a place where they can, if they have experienced abuse, but if they haven't experienced abuse, as well, like for sure, thinking of people in terms of the context of like, I have a role to play supporting somebody else. And so if someone has experienced abuse, that they're at a place where they've processed it, or at a place where they've sort of moved to a place where they can sort of now reflect on their experience, but then hold space for other people who might be experiencing abuse. Um, and I think we were lucky with the relationships. Like after the first pilot, like we started with the 8 women, and honestly, I thought we would just have one group after that. Like I was like, or a few groups, but that we would be facilitating one group at a time. Um, But I think those relationships and their positive experience, like they reached out within their networks and people were interested. And so I think that was really lucky that we already had a relationship with them, but through the program strengthened the relationship and that they really felt invested. They felt like, actually, this was a really valuable program. Like I gained something from this. And I could see my friends participating in this as well. And, and sometimes women did share, like they shared it with friends. And when they joined the program, they said, my friend shared this with me and I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to join or not because of the topic, but she said, no, just try, attend. You'll value what you learn and shared that they were glad that they made the choice to attend afterwards. And so I think there is I think we didn't want to hide. We're talking about IPV. That was always really clear, but I think it's how we're talking about IPV and what we're hoping people gain from that conversation and walk away with.
That's so helpful, and I like the emphasis you made on like the leadership aspect of it too, and the distinction, Tegrid, that you made as well, that it's not a program that's for people who are experiencing abuse or violence at the time. So it's really helpful. Thank you both for taking the time to answer all of the questions from our audience and the feedback. If you take a moment to look at the chat, you'll notice that you've gotten so much positive feedback, and people really enjoyed your style of sharing this presentation and are looking forward to the resources in the future. So thank you very much both for taking the time, for being here today, and for sharing with our audience. Lots that we learned from you both. That is all the time that we have for today. So I really want to thank our presenters, Yasmin, Tagrid, and I also want to take an opportunity to thank our ASL interpreters, Joanne and Rogue. And I also want to take an opportunity to say thank you to the Learning Network team. We have Jasmine Tabibi and we have Jade Vanya as well that's supporting in the background. Please don't forget to complete the evaluation form to receive a certificate of participation. A link will automatically open in your browser after the event has ended. We at the Learning Network hope to see you at the next Resource Spotlight, and we wish everyone a happy holiday. Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Margarita, for facilitating the Q&A.
You're very welcome. Thanks for
Thank
being
you
here.
for this opportunity. Hope everyone have a good day.